Hey everybody, it's Rory from ANS Gear, and today we're going to learn how to do some general maintenance on your paintball markers. Okay, so we've had some requests to talk about trigger adjustment and how to change the trigger on a mini GS. So we have a GS here, we're going to pull it apart and show you the three basic sections of the trigger, or what you can adjust on the trigger. Two of them we can see from the outside, and the third one we really can't see very well. So let's get we'll get this front grip off, because in order to get the frame off the gun, we need to pull the front grip off. Just because there's a screw that you have to get to on the inside there. Let's take that off of there. And then we can remove this one, which sits under here. Ooh, get that out of there. Now with this front one removed, we can pull the two frame screws out. And then we can separate these two pieces away. So with our trigger, you've got, I don't think I can push this out. No, I can. I'm actually going to take this out as well. That way I will pull the whole trigger out so you guys can see all the pieces to the trigger. We can get that out of there. So that's our trigger pin right here that we popped out, and then our two screws that just hold the grips on up at the top. So here's our trigger right here, and you've got three adjustment screws on it. You've got this one, this middle one, and then this top one up here, which you can see from the outside. It's kind of hard to see the front one, but it's right up in there, right there. But there's this other one back here that you can't see, and you can't actually get to it very well when it's on the gun. You can push the trigger forward like this, and then you can get to it up in there, but it's a little hard to get an Allen key on sometimes because the trigger doesn't move far enough. So what do these three, or I should say four screws, actually do? So you've got this bottom one, which is your magnetic return right here. So this is a magnet, and then you've got a magnet that's in the frame right there, and these are going to push against each other, and they're going to want to push the trigger back out. So this is like your spring return, and depending on how you set this, whether it is closer or further away, it's going to start activating closer or further away. If you have this screwed in or this way, so that the magnets are closer together, they're going to start to repel quicker, or earlier, I should say. So your spring back will be sooner. If you move this further away, the trigger's going to have to travel a little bit further before those magnets want to repel each other, and your trigger will be softer, if you want to look at it like that. So that's what this bottom one does. The next one up is your travel stop. So as you pull the trigger and the trigger moves backwards, this second screw up controls how far it can move before it stops. So depending on how you set this, you can control the travel of the trigger. The next one up at the top right here controls the starting position of the trigger. So when the trigger comes back forward like this and is at rest, this screw at the top is resting against the frame, or not the frame, the body up here. So depending on where or how far up or down this screw is, it's going to control whether the trigger sits here, or it sits out a little bit further, or out a little bit further. So if you screw this set screw up closer to the gun, it's going to bring the trigger back, and it's going to make the trigger pull shorter. If you back it down, and this is going to come down like this, away from the body, it's going to let the trigger rock forward, and it's going to make your trigger pull longer. Now, that does not control activation point, though. It only controls the distance that the trigger moves. This screw and this screw control distances, whether it be the starting position controlled by this or the ending position controlled by this. That is all they do. They do not control activation. That's what this fourth screw is right here. So this screw is the one that actually pushes against the micro switch in the gun. So depending on where you have the trigger set up in its limited travel, you can control where you want the switch to be activated. So you can have this screw way down so that the trigger is as far forward as possible. Even though this is an exaggeration, it would be forward. And if you were to move this screw up so that it is resting basically on the switch right there, as soon as you started to pull the trigger, you would hit the switch. Okay? Now you can run into a problem with this. If you have this so high up that your trigger is resting on the switch like this, and you pull the trigger, you barely start to touch the trigger and or pull the trigger, and the switch activates, you have a ton more travel that the trigger can go through before it finally gets to its stop position. And you can damage this switch. If you've got more travel after activation than will allow by the switch placement, this screw will actually go up and it will crush the micro switch. So once you hear this click like that, the trench could be this way actually, you should have a little bit more travel, and then your stop screw should hit the frame. You never want to bottom this switch out. You never want to be able to pull the trigger and crush this switch all the way down. You should activate the switch, personally for me, activate the switch, have a little bit of travel, and then stop. Some people like their activation right at the beginning of their pull, in the middle of the pull, towards the end of the pull, whatever it happens to be, but you never want to press the switch down and then have the trigger keep moving till it bottoms out and then crushes your micro switch. So it's really just a lot of trial and error, setting it up how you feel comfortable with it. You can go too far. If you have this too far up and this is not coming back far enough, you can have the trigger set up where it's holding down the micro switch when you power the gun on. The gun will automatically jump into programming mode then. If you turn your gun on and it goes right into programming mode, that's because your trigger is set up so the switch is activated or on in the resting position. Either your activation point is set too high or your travel position is set too high also, and it's causing the trigger to rock backwards and push the switch down. One of those two. So I always take this trigger and I will basically put everything at an even position. I would bring this down till it's flush with this. I would bring this down till it's flush with the back here. And then I would stall it and I would see what it does. Most often, or more often than not on this gun, if you put this activation screw flush with the trigger and you pull the trigger, nothing's going to happen. It won't activate the switch. So you'll need to bring this up a little bit further, check it, bring it up a little further, check it. Once you get it activating, then start to adjust where your trigger position sits. If you find that your switch was activating, and then you start to adjust your trigger and you activate the switch just by adjustment, then you need to back this down a little bit. So it's really a teeter-totter effect of too far, too close, and just taking the time to really play around with it. It's not something that you want to do 3 minutes before you're trying to play a game at the field. This is something you should be doing the night before or early the morning of, and trying to really get a feel of how you want your trigger set up in there. Let me put this back together real quick. It's really a preference thing. There is no right way to set up a trigger. You just do it the way you think feels comfortable and the way you like it. You can't be wrong. The only way you can be wrong in setting up a trigger is if you break something. Then you're wrong. But if it's comfortable to you, if you have a really short trigger pull and then a Activation right away, great. Nothing wrong with that. You can do it how you want to do it. It's your gun. Have fun with it. But just don't go to the point where you're breaking things. So let's throw this back together real quick. Actually, you guys don't need to see me put this back together. You know how it goes back together. Slides back on like that. So trigger programming, or trigger, I don't want to call it programming. Setting up the trigger is really simple. There's not a lot of pieces to screw up. Just be careful with your activation so you don't damage your micro switch. And that's how you do it.